The blizzard of 1887 would be remembered as the worst in Montana Territory history. But for one rugged rancher, it became the storm that changed everything. When 7 desperate children appeared at his door with news that would break any man's heart, he had no idea that his decision in the next few minutes would transform not just their lives, but his own forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind screamed across the Yellowstone Valley like a banshee that February morning, driving snow so thick that Jacob Sullivan couldn't see his own barn from the kitchen window. He stood there, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the white wall of fury that had been building since before dawn. At 42, Jacob had weathered plenty of Montana storms, but this one felt different, meaner, the kind that buried livestock and broke men's spirits. His ranch, the Triple Crown, sat in a valley 20 miles northeast of Billings, far enough from civilization that his nearest neighbor was old Pete Henderson, and Pete's place was still 8 miles through rough country. Jacob preferred it that way. Had ever since Martha died 3 winters back, taking their unborn child with her. The isolation suited a man who'd learned that caring too much only led to heartbreak. The ranch house was built solid thick log walls, chinked tight against the wind, a stone foundation that wouldn't shift, and a roof heavy enough to shed the worst snow. Jacob had built it with his own hands back in '78, when he still believed in the future, when Martha's laughter still echoed through these rooms. Now it felt too big for one man, too quiet except for the howl of wind and the occasional creak of settling timber. He'd been up since 4, as was his habit, tending to the animals in the barn. The cattle were huddled in the lee of the shelter he'd built along the north pasture, but they'd be fine if they stayed put. His horses, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess and 2 geldings, Thunder and Scout, were secure in their stalls with plenty of hay. The chickens were shut up tight in their coop, and he'd chopped enough wood yesterday to last a week if needed. Jacob was nothing if not prepared. He'd learned early that Montana didn't forgive the careless or the lazy. His father, Samuel Sullivan, had drilled that into him before consumption took the old man in '75. "This land will test you, boy," Samuel had wheezed from his deathbed. "It'll push you until you break or bend. Make sure you bend." Jacob had bent plenty over the years, but he'd never broken. Not when the drought of '82 killed half his cattle. Not when Martha's fever burned too high for too long. Not when the silence of this house became so loud it nearly drove him to drink. He'd bent, adapted, endured. It's what Sullivan men did. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he liked it. He'd made it in Martha's old blue enamel pot, the one with the chip on the handle that she'd gotten from her mother back in Ohio. Some mornings he thought about getting a new one, but habit was a powerful thing, and the pot still made good coffee. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. The thermometer on the porch read 18 below, and that was before accounting for the wind. Jacob estimated the gusts were hitting 40, maybe 50 miles per hour. Weather like this killed people, froze them solid if they got caught out in it. He'd found more than one traveler over the years, stiff as a board in a snowdrift, their faces peaceful as if they'd just laid down for a nap. He finished his coffee and moved to the pantry to take inventory. Beans, flour, salt pork, tinned peaches, dried corn enough to last him a month if he was careful. The root cellar held potatoes, turnips, and carrots from last fall's harvest. The spring house, built over a natural spring that never froze, kept his milk and butter cold. He was set for a long siege if necessary. Jacob had always been a planner, a man who thought 3 moves ahead. Maybe it came from his years as a cavalry scout before he'd settled down, or maybe it was just his nature. Either way, it had served him well. When other ranchers were scrambling for supplies or losing stock to weather, Jacob was already prepared. The house creaked around him as the wind found every gap and tested every joint. But the structure held firm, the way he'd built it to. Double thick walls, joints fitted tight as a puzzle, foundations sunk deep below the frost line. This house would outlast him, he reckoned. Maybe outlast anyone who cared to live in it. He walked through the rooms slowly, a morning ritual that had become habit. The front parlor with Martha's rocking chair, still positioned by the window where she used to sit and sew. The bedroom where he'd carried her when the fever took hold, where he'd held her hand as the life slipped away. The small room they'd planned as a nursery, now closed off and gathering dust. Each room held memories like pressed flowers between the pages of a book, beautiful but fragile, liable to crumble if handled too roughly. So Jacob moved through them carefully, acknowledging their presence without dwelling, the way a man might tip his hat to an old acquaintance on the street. The kitchen was where he spent most of his time now. It was practical, functional, without the weight of dreams that pressed down in the other rooms. Here he could fry his eggs, tend his coffee, read his newspapers when the mail got through. Here he could be just a man going about his business, not a widower rattling around in a house built for a family he'd never have by mid-morning. The storm had intensified to the point where Jacob couldn't see the barn, though it was only 50 yards from the house. The snow wasn't falling so much as flying sideways, driven by wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. He'd seen storms like this before, the kind that could bury a man alive if he lost his way. Between buildings, he checked his rifle, though he didn't expect trouble. Wolves sometimes got bold during bad weather, and desperate men sometimes did desperate things. The Winchester was loaded and ready, propped beside the front door where he could reach it quick if needed. Next to it hung his heavy buffalo coat, the one that had saved his life more than once during his scouting days. Fire in the stone hearth burned steady and warm, fed by split oak from the woodpile he'd stacked high as a man's head. The flames danced orange and gold, casting shifting shadows on the walls. It was a comforting sound, the snap and hiss of burning wood, one of the few sounds that could compete with the howling wind outside. Jacob settled into his leather chair. By the fire, a book open on his lap, Dickens' Great Expectations, which he'd been working through for the second time. Reading helped pass the hours when the weather trapped him inside, helped keep his mind sharp when days might pass without seeing another human soul. But concentration was hard to come by with the storm raging like a living thing beyond the walls. The wind rose and fell in waves, sometimes dropping to a mere moan before building to a shriek that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. Snow hissed against the windows like thrown sand, and somewhere outside, something loose was banging. In the wind, probably the barn door, though he'd latched it tight. This was how life went for a man alone in the territory. Long stretches of solitude broken by moments of crisis. Peaceful days that lulled you into thinking the world was tame, followed by reminders that nature was still the master here, still called the shots. Jacob had made his peace with it, or thought he had. He was reaching for his coffee mug when the sound came, faint at first, almost lost in the wind. A rhythmic thumping that didn't match the random banging of loose boards or the irregular gusts of the storm. It was deliberate, desperate, the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on his front door. Jacob set down his book and listened hard. There it was again, 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Someone was out there in this killing weather, and they needed help. He moved quickly to the window beside the door, wiping away the frost that had formed on the glass. Through the swirling snow, he could barely make out shapes on his porch, small shapes huddled together against the wind. Children. Jacob's heart lurched as he threw back the bolt and yanked open the door. A blast of Arctic air hit him like a physical blow, and snow swirled into the entryway. On his porch stood 7 children, ranging from what looked like a teenager down to a little one who couldn't have been more than 4. They were bundled in worn coats and ragged scarves, their faces red with cold, their eyes wide with fear and desperation. The oldest, A boy of maybe 15 with sandy hair poking out from under a knit cap stepped forward. His voice was hoarse from the cold and wind, but his words cut through Jacob's soul like a knife. "Please, mister," the boy said, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Our mama is dying in the snowstorm. She sent us to find help. Please, you got to come with us." Jacob stared at the 7 frightened faces looking up at him, snow already accumulating on their shoulders, their small bodies shaking with cold. Behind them, the storm raged with undiminished fury, and somewhere out in that white hell was a woman fighting for her life. In that moment, standing in his doorway with the wind howling and these children pleading for help, Jacob Sullivan felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart begin to crack. The isolation he'd chosen, the safety of solitude, the protection of caring for no one but himself, all of it was about to be tested by the most dangerous thing in the world: hope. He looked into the boy's eyes and saw his own reflection, desperate, determined, refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. And Jacob knew, with the certainty that comes from deep in a man's bones, that his carefully ordered life was about to change forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jacob didn't hesitate. "Get inside, all of you, now." He stepped back as the 7 children stumbled through his doorway, their boots tracking snow and ice across the wooden floor. The smallest ones were crying soft, exhausted, sobs that spoke of hours spent fighting the cold. The older boy who'd spoken shut the door behind them, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the latch. "Strip off those wet coats," Jacob commanded, already moving toward the hearth. He grabbed an armload of quilts from the chest by his chair and began wrapping them around the smaller children. "You're half frozen. How long have you been out in this?" "Since before dawn," the oldest boy replied, helping a girl who looked about 10 unwrap a scarf from her face. We walked for hours looking for help. Mama said to find the nearest ranch, said someone would help us." Jacob counted them quickly as he worked to get them warm. 7 children, ranging from the teenage boy down to a little girl with blonde curls who couldn't have been more than 4. They were thin, too thin, and their clothes, while clean, showed the careful patches and mending that spoke of poverty. But their eyes held something that struck him. They weren't broken. Scared, cold, desperate, yes, but not broken. "What are your names?" he asked, kneeling beside the smallest girl and rubbing her tiny hands between his own to restore circulation. "I'm Tommy," the oldest boy said. "Tommy Richardson. This here's my sister Mary." He indicated the 10-year-old girl. "That's Sarah, she's 8. The twins there are Ben and Billy, they're 6, Emma's 4. He pointed to each child in turn, then looked down at the smallest one. "And this little one is Rose. She just turned 3 last month." Jacob nodded, filing away each name, each face. The children were obviously siblings. They all shared the same dark brown hair and serious brown eyes, except for little Rose with her blonde curls. "And your mother?" Tommy's face crumpled for just a moment before he steeled himself. "Her name's Catherine Richardson. She got real sick 2 days ago. Started with a cough, then fever, then she couldn't hardly breathe. Yesterday, she sent us out to find help, but the storm caught us. We found an old cabin about 3 miles from here, then holed up there trying to keep her warm. What happened to your father?" Jacob asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Died in a mine collapse last spring," Mary spoke. "Up," her voice steady despite her chattering teeth. "Up in Butte City. Mama's been trying to get us to her sister in Oregon, but we got caught by winter before we could make it through the mountains." Jacob felt his chest tighten. A widow with 7 children, traveling alone, caught by Montana winter. It was a death sentence under the best circumstances. In this storm, it was a miracle any of them were still alive. "How sick is she?" he asked Tommy. The boy's composure finally cracked. "Real sick, sir. She can't hardly stay awake, and when she breathes, it sounds like she's drowning. She keeps saying she's cold, but she's burning up with fever. I don't think she's got much time left." Jacob stood up, his mind already working through the logistics. 3 miles in this storm might as well be 30. The temperature was still dropping, and visibility was near zero. But if he didn't try, a woman would die, and these 7 children would be orphans in the middle of the worst blizzard in decades. "Tommy, I need you to tell me exactly where this cabin is," he said, moving to the kitchen and starting to gather supplies. "Every landmark you remember, every turn you took." "You're going to help her?" little Emma asked, her voice small but hopeful. Jacob looked down at the child-thin face. Dark eyes too old for her years, blonde hair escaping from a knit cap, something twisted in his chest, a pain he'd thought he'd buried with Martha. "Yes, honey. I'm going to help your mama." For the next few minutes, Jacob moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. He filled a leather satchel with medical supplies, laudanum for pain, willow bark for fever, clean bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for sterilization. From the kitchen, he packed dried beef, hardtack, and a jar of honey. 2 wool blankets went into a waterproof canvas bag, along with a change of men's clothes that might fit the woman. All the while, Tommy gave him directions to the cabin. "You follow the creek bed east for about a mile. Then there's a big dead pine that's been struck by lightning. You turn north there and climb up through a gap in the rocks. The cabin's in a little clearing. Just past that, it's got a tin roof that's half caved in." Jacob knew the place. It was an old trapper's cabin, abandoned for years. He was amazed it was still standing, much less providing any kind of shelter. But it was better than being out in the open. "Listen to me, all of you," Jacob said, turning to face the children. "I'm going to bring your mother back here, but it's going to take time. You need to stay put, stay warm, and stay together. Tommy, you're in charge. There's food in the pantry: bread, beans, some preserved peaches. The fire needs to be fed every hour. Can you handle that?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. We won't be any trouble." "You're not trouble," Jacob said firmly. "You're children who need help, and that's what neighbors do. We help each other." He was pulling on his heavy buffalo coat when little Rose tugged at his pants leg. He knelt down to her level, and she whispered something so quietly he had to lean in to hear. "Tell Mama that Rose is being good," she said, her small hand touching his bearded cheek. "Tell her Rose wants her to come home." Jacob felt his throat close up. He managed to nod, then stood and gathered his gear. The rifle went across his back, the medical supplies in the saddlebag, rope coiled on his belt. He was as ready as a man could be for what amounted to a rescue mission in the middle of hell. Opening the door was like facing down a wild animal. The wind hit him with physical force, driving snow into his eyes and stealing his breath. He could barely make out the barn through the white maelstrom, but he knew every step of the way. Duchess, his Baymare, nickered nervously as he entered the barn. She could sense the storm's fury and didn't want any part of it. "I know, girl," Jacob murmured, saddling her quickly, "but we've got work to do." He led her out into the storm, pulling the barn door shut behind him. The wind tried to tear the reins from his hands as he mounted, and Duchess danced sideways, fighting the bit. Jacob turned her toward the creek bed, following Tommy's directions, and let her pick her way carefully through the drifts. The world had turned into a white nightmare. Snow drove horizontally across his vision, limiting sight to maybe 10 feet. In any direction. The cold was brutal. He could feel it seeping through his coat, numbing his fingers despite his thick gloves. Ice formed on his beard within minutes, and his eyes watered constantly from the wind. Duchess struggled through drifts that reached her belly, her breath coming in great white clouds. Several times Jacob had to dismount and lead her around fallen trees or through particularly deep snow. The creek bed, normally a reliable navigation aid, was completely obscured. He was navigating by instinct and prayer, following the lay of the land and hoping he was heading in the right direction. The dead lightning struck pine Tommy had mentioned loomed out of the snow like a ghostly sentinel. Jacob turned north, climbing. Through the gap in the rocks, Duchess's hooves slipping on ice-covered stone. The wind howled through the gap like a banshee, and for a moment, Jacob wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. A man could die out here, freeze solid, not be found until spring. But then he thought of those 7 faces looking up at him, of little Rose asking him to tell her mama she was being good, of Tommy trying so hard to be strong for his siblings. And he thought of a woman named Catherine Richardson, dying alone in an abandoned cabin while her children fought their way through a blizzard to find help. Jacob Sullivan had lost too much already. He wasn't going to lose this fight. The cabin appeared suddenly through the swirling snow. A dark shape hunched against the storm like a wounded animal. Smoke trickled weakly from a makeshift chimney, and one window glowed with the faint orange light of a dying fire. Jacob tied Duchess to a post that was still standing and shouldered his gear. The door hung askew on broken hinges. Jacob pushed through it and stepped into the dim interior, stamping snow from his boots. The cabin was barely larger than a single room, with a stone fireplace, a crude table, and what might once have been a bed. The roof leaked in several places, and the walls had gaps where the chinking had fallen out. On a pile of rags and blankets near the fire lay Catherine Richardson. Jacob had seen death before, had watched it claim his wife and too many others. He recognized the gray pallor, the labored breathing, the way a person seemed to be fading away from the inside out. But Catherine Richardson was still fighting. Her eyes, though cloudy with fever, tracked to him as he knelt beside her. "Are you ... Cook," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you the rancher? Did my children ... Did they find you?" "Yes, ma'am," Jacob said gently, opening his medical bag. "I'm Jacob Sullivan. Your children are safe and warm at my place. I'm here to take you to them." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was going to die without seeing them again." Jacob checked her pulse rapid and thready and felt her forehead. The fever was high, dangerously so, and her breathing was shallow and congested. She needed proper care, and she needed it soon. "Well, Mrs. Richardson," he said, preparing a dose of willow bark tea. "Today's not that day. We're going home." Catherine Richardson was dying, and Jacob could see it in every labored breath she took. Her skin had taken on the waxy pallor that came before the end, and when he lifted her wrist to check her pulse, her hand was both burning hot and somehow fragile, like old parchment that might crumble at his touch. "Mrs. Richardson, I need to get you back to my ranch," Jacob said, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency clawing at his chest. "It's going to be a rough ride, but you'll die for certain if we stay here." Catherine's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on his face. "The children, are they really safe?" "Safe and warm by my fire," Jacob assured her, already working to bundle her in the blankets he'd brought. "Tommy's looking after the little ones. Rose wanted me to tell you she's being good." A ghost of a smile crossed Catherine's cracked lips. "She's always good. They all are. I just ... I couldn't give them what they needed, couldn't keep them safe." "You got them through a blizzard to find help," Jacob said firmly, lifting her as gently as he could. "That's not failing, ma'am. That's fighting." Catherine weighed almost nothing in his arms, her body consumed by whatever sickness had taken hold. Pneumonia most likely, though Jacob was no doctor. He'd seen enough of it during his cavalry days to recognize the rattling breath, the fever. That burned a person from the inside out. Without proper medicine and care, it was a death sentence. But Jacob Sullivan hadn't ridden through a killing blizzard to watch a woman die. He carried Catherine outside into the howling wind, where Duchess waited with snow accumulating on her back. The mare stamped nervously as Jacob approached, her eyes rolling white at the scent of sickness and the fury of the storm. Getting Catherine onto the horse was going to be the first challenge. Jacob had fashioned a makeshift travois from branches and rope before leaving his ranch, but the terrain between here and home was too rough for it to work. He was going to have to ride double, holding Catherine in front of him, trusting Duchess to find her way home through the white hell that surrounded them. "This is going to hurt," he warned Catherine as he lifted her onto the saddle. She bit back, a cry as he positioned her against his chest, one arm wrapped around her waist to keep her secure. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the heat of her fever through his coat. "The children," she whispered. "If I don single quotes T. if something happens ... Nothing's going to happen," Jacob said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Himself, "We're going home." He turned Duchess toward what he hoped was the direction of his ranch and gave her her head. The mare had been born and raised in Montana. She understood storms better than most humans. If anyone could find the way home through this white maze, it was her. The journey became a nightmare of cold and wind and the constant fear that Catherine would slip from his grasp. Her breathing grew more labored as they rode, punctuated by fits of coughing that sprayed blood onto the snow. Jacob held her tighter, sharing what warmth he could, talking to her continuously to keep her conscious. "Tell me about your children," he said as Duchess picked her way carefully down what he thought was the creek bed. "Tommy seems like a good boy. He's had to grow up too fast," Catherine managed between rattling breaths. "After his father died, he became the man of the family. Only 15, but he carries it all. And Mary? Smart as a whip. Reads everything she can get her hands on. Wants to be a teacher someday." Catherine's voice was barely audible over the wind. "Sarah's the dreamer. Always making up stories, seeing magic in everything. The twins, Ben and Billy, they're handful but good-hearted boys. What about the little ones?" Catherine was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she'd lost consciousnness. Then she spoke, her words slurred with fever and exhaustion. "Emma's my helper. Takes care of Rose like she's her own baby. And Rose ... Rose is sunshine. Even when we had nothing, she'd find something to smile about." Jacob felt something break open in his chest as he listened. These weren't just 7 children. They were a family held together by love and the fierce determination of a woman who'd refused to give up even when everything fell apart. The storm seemed to intensify as they rode, if such a thing was possible. The wind shifted directions constantly, sometimes pushing them forward, sometimes threatening to knock them from the saddle. Ice formed on Jacob's beard and mustache, and his fingers began to lose feeling despite his thick gloves. But he held on, keeping Catherine pressed against him, feeling for the steady rhythm of her heart. Duchess stumbled in a deep drift, going down to her knees before scrambling back to her feet. The jolt sent a spasm of coughing through Catherine, and when it passed, Jacob felt her go limp in his arms. "Catherine?" He pressed his ear close to her mouth and felt the faint whisper of breath. "Still alive, but barely. Stay with me. Your children need you." Time became meaningless in the white void. Jacob couldn't tell if they'd been riding for minutes or hours. His landmarks were invisible, swallowed by the storm. Several times he thought they were lost, circling back on their own trail, doomed to wander until they froze. But Duchess kept moving with the confidence of an animal following instincts older than human memory. Then through the swirling snow, Jacob saw a faint yellow glow that could only be the windows of his ranch house. Relief flooded through him so strongly that his knees nearly buckled as he dismounted. They'd made it. The barn was closer, and Jacob headed there first. He needed to get Catherine inside, out of the wind, while he decided how to safely move her to the house. But as he approached the barn door, it swung open, and Tommy Richardson stepped out into the storm. "Mr. Sullivan." The boy shouted over the wind. "Did you find her? Did you find Mama?" Behind Tommy, Jacob could see the faces of the other children, crowded in the barn doorway. They'd been watching, waiting, probably since the moment he'd left. The sight of them, these 7 young souls who'd endured so much, gave Jacob strength he didn't know he had left. "I found her," Jacob called back, carefully dismounting while keeping Catherine secure in his arms. "She's alive, but she's real sick. Tommy, I need you to help me get her to the house." Tommy didn't hesitate. Despite his own exhaustion, the boy plunged into the snow, helping Jacob carry his mother's limp form. The other children followed, their young faces tight with worry and hope in equal measure. Getting Catherine into the house and settled by the fire took all of them working together. Jacob directed the operation like a field commander, his military training taking over. Mary and Sarah prepared hot water while Tommy helped strip away Catherine's wet clothes and wrap her in dry blankets. The smaller children stayed close, but out of the way, their dark eyes never leaving their mother's still form. "Is she going to die?" little Emma asked, her voice small and scared. Jacob looked down at the child. Seeing the same fear in her eyes that he'd carried the night Martha's fever spiked. He knelt beside Emma, putting his hands on her small shoulders. "I don't know, honey," he said honestly. "She's real sick, but she's fighting, and she's got something powerful to fight for." He gestured to the circle of children around the fireplace. "She's got all of you." For the next several hours, Jacob fought a battle as desperate as any he'd waged during his military service. He dosed Catherine with willow bark tea to bring down the fever, elevated her head to help her breathing, and used steam from boiling water to try to clear her lungs. The children helped as they could, fetching supplies, changing cold compresses, taking turns holding their mother's hand. Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling names, sometimes crying out in delirium. During her lucid moments, she would look around at her children with eyes that held both love and desperate fear. "Promise me," she whispered to Jacob during one of these moments, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "If something happens to me, promise you won't let them be separated. They need to stay together." Jacob felt the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders like a lid blanket. 7 children, orphaned in the middle of nowhere, with the nearest town a days. Right away, and winter still months from ending. What could one man do with 7 children? But looking at Catherine's fevered eyes, seeing the trust there, Jacob heard himself speak words that would change his life forever. "I promise," he said. "They'll stay together." As dawn approached, though the storm made it impossible to tell Catherine's breathing became more labored. The children gathered closer, sensing something was changing. Little Rose climbed onto the couch beside her mother, curling up against her side like a kitten seeking warmth. "Mama," Rose whispered. "I was good, Mr. Sullivan said I was good." Catherine's eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in hours. She looked around at each of her children, memorizing their faces, and Jacob saw her making her own desperate calculations, deciding whether to fight or let go, choosing between the pain of holding on and the peace of release. "I love you," she told them, her voice barely a whisper. "All of you. Be good for each other. Take care of each other." "You're going to be fine, Mama," Tommy said, but his voice cracked on the words. Catherine's eyes found Jacob's across the flickering firelight. In them, he saw a question that no parent should ever have to ask and no stranger should ever have to answer. But Jacob nodded, understanding passing between them without words. Then Catherine Richardson closed her eyes, drew 3 more rattling breaths, and was still. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling of the wind outside and the soft sobs of 7 children, who had just lost the only parent they had left in the world. Death had a particular silence to it, Jacob knew. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, a weight that settled into a room and changed everything it touched. As Catherine Richardson drew her final breath, that silence descended on his ranch house like a shroud, broken only by little Rose's confused whimpering and the storm still raging beyond the walls. 7 pairs of brown eyes turned to him, waiting. They'd lost their father to a mine collapse, survived a brutal winter journey, and now watched their mother slip away despite his best efforts. Yet somehow, impossibly, they were looking to him for what came next. Jacob Sullivan had never felt so unprepared for anything in his life. Tommy was the first to speak, his 15-year-old voice cracking with grief and desperate responsibility. What do we do now, Mr. Sullivan?" Jacob looked down at Catherine's peaceful face, then at the circle of children who'd just become orphans. The promise he'd made echoed in his mind. They'll stay together. Easy words to speak in the heat of the moment, but the reality of caring for 7 children hit him like a physical blow. "First, we take care of your mother," Jacob said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos in his thoughts. "She deserves to be laid to rest proper." The older children understood, but the younger ones looked confused. Little Rose kept patting her mother's arm, trying to wake her up. "Mama sleeping?" she asked, her baby voice cutting through Jacob's. Mary, the 10-year-old with 2 serious eyes, gently lifted Rose away from the couch. "Yes, honey," she said, though tears streamed down her cheeks. "Mama's sleeping now." Jacob watched Mary comfort her little sister, saw how naturally she stepped into the role, and realized these children had been taking care of each other long before they'd arrived at his door. Tommy managing the family like a grown man, Mary mothering the younger ones, all of them working together to survive. They weren't just children, they were a unit, forged by hardship into something stronger than their individual parts. "The storm's too bad to do anything proper right now," Jacob said carefully. "But we'll move her to the spare room, make her comfortable. When the weather breaks, we'll see about." He stopped, realizing he had no idea what the proper protocol was for burying someone on a ranch 20 miles from the nearest town. "Papa's buried in Boot City," Tommy said, reading Jacob's hesitation. "Mama always said she wanted to be laid to rest beside him when her time came." Jacob nodded, though he wondered how in the world they'd managed to transport a body all the way to Butte City. That was a problem for later, when the immediate crisis of 7 orphaned children wasn't staring him in the face. With Tommy's help, Jacob carefully moved Catherine to the small spare room off the kitchen. They laid her on the narrow bed, arranged her hands peacefully, and covered her with a clean quilt. The children filed through one by one to say their goodbyes, the older ones understanding the finality, the younger ones still confused but sensing the gravity of the moment. When they'd closed the door, Jacob found himself facing 7 expectant faces again. The fire crackled in the hearth, the storm howled outside, and somewhere in the space between those sounds, Jacob heard the echo of his own voice making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Are you going to send us to the orphanage?" Sarah, the 8-year-old dreamer, asked with surprising directness. Jacob's throat tightened. He'd heard stories about the territorial orphanages overcrowded, underfunded places where children were more likely to be worked to death than given proper care. The idea of these 7 ending up in such a place made his chest burn with anger. "No," he said firmly. "I made a promise to your mother, and I keep my promises. But what are we going to do?" Mary asked. "You can't just keep us all. 7 children is a lot for one man." Jacob looked around his house, the house he'd built for the family he'd lost, now filled with voices and movement and life in a way it hadn't been since Martha died. It was overwhelming and terrifying and somehow, inexplicably, felt right. "We're going to figure it out together," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "First thing is getting through this storm. Then we'll work on the rest." The next 3 days tested every resource Jacob had, both practical and emotional. The blizzard continued with relentless fury, keeping them trapped inside while 7 children grieved their mother and adjusted to their new reality. Jacob found himself learning on the fly how to manage a house full of kids, each with their own needs and personalities. Tommy tried to carry too much responsibility, attempting to parent his siblings while dealing with his own grief. Jacob had to gently but firmly establish that he was the adult in charge now, that Tommy could be a big brother instead of a father figure. Mary threw herself into helping with household tasks, cooking and cleaning with a desperate efficiency that spoke of her need to feel useful. Jacob recognized the pattern. He'd done the same thing after Martha died, working himself to exhaustion to avoid feeling the pain. Sarah retreated into herself, sitting by the window and making up stories about the storm being a great white dragon that would eventually fly away and take all their troubles with it. Her imagination was a shield, Jacob realized, protecting her from realities too harsh for an 8-year-old to bear. The twins, Ben and Billy, dealt with grief the way 6-year-old boys often did, through constant motion and noise. They wrestled, ran through the house, and got into everything, driving their siblings to distraction. But Jacob saw the fear underneath their energy, the way they stuck close together as if afraid one might disappear like their parents had. Emma, at 4, understood that something terrible had happened, but couldn't quite grasp the permanence of it. She kept asking when Mama was coming back, when they were going home, when Papa would return from his long trip. Each question was a knife twist in Jacob's heart, and Rose, little 3-year-old, Rose with her blonde curls and trusting smile, seemed to accept the change with the adaptability of very young children. She followed Jacob around the house, climbed into his lap during meals, and began calling him Mr. Jake in her baby voice. Jacob found himself remembering skills he'd thought forgotten from his own childhood in a large family. How to mediate fights between siblings, how to stretch meals to feed extra mouths, how to comfort a crying child in the middle of the night. But more than that, he found himself feeling protective of these 7 small souls in a way that surprised him with its intensity. On the second night, he was awakened by soft crying from the main room. He found Emma sitting by the dying fire, tears streaming down her face, holding a small wooden doll that must have been among their few possessions. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Jacob asked, settling down beside her. "I dreamed about Mama," Emma whispered. "She was trying to find us, but she couldn't. She was lost in the snow, calling our names." Jacob gathered the little girl into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs. "Your mama's not lost," he said softly. "She's in a place where there's no more cold, no more hunger, no more worry. And she knows exactly where you are, safe and warm with someone who's going to take care of you. Are you really going to keep us?" Emma asked, looking up at him with eyes that held far too much understanding for a 4-year-old. Jacob felt the weight of that promise again, but this time it didn't feel like a burden. Looking down at Emma's trusting face, he realized that somewhere in the past 2 days, his obligation had transformed into something else entirely. These weren't just 7 children he'd agreed to care for. They were becoming his children. "Yes," he said, and meant it completely. "You're home now." The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached the windows in places, and the barn was nearly buried, but the wind had died and weak sunlight filtered through breaking clouds. Jacob spent the morning digging out paths and checking on the livestock, while the children pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at the changed landscape. That afternoon, as he was splitting wood behind the house, Jacob saw a rider approaching through the snow. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle, propped nearby. Visitors during winter storms usually meant trouble. But as the figure got closer, he recognized Doc Patterson from Billings, the man's black bag visible even from a distance. "Jacob," Doc called as he rode into the yard. "Heard you might need some help." Young Pete Henderson made it to town. Said he saw lights at your place during the worst of the storm. Figured you might have taken in some travelers. Jacob leaned the axe against the woodpile, his mind racing. Doc Patterson was a good man, but he was also the unofficial representative of territorial authority when it came to matters like orphaned children. What he decided about the Richardson children could change everything. "Come inside, Doc," Jacob said carefully. "Got some coffee on, and there's folks you should meet." As they walked toward the house, Jacob could see the children watching. From the windows, 7 faces full of hope and fear, waiting to see if their new life was about to be torn away from them before it had even begun. The next few minutes would determine whether Jacob Sullivan kept his promise to a dying woman, or whether he'd have to watch 7 children be scattered to the winds like leaves in a Montana storm. Doc Patterson stamped the snow from his boots and stepped into Jacob's house, his weathered face taking in the scene with the sharp eyes of a man accustomed to reading situations quickly. 7 children clustered near the fireplace, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wariness as they studied the newcomer. The smell of coffee and cornbread filled the air, along with something else, the indefinable atmosphere of a house suddenly full of life. "Well now," Doc said, removing his hat and setting down his black bag. "Looks like you've got quite a house full, Jacob." "Doc Patterson, I'd like you to meet the Richardson children," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral. "Tommy, Mary, Sarah, Ben, Billy, Emma, and Rose. Their mother passed 3 days ago during the storm." Doc's expression sobered immediately. He'd been the territorial doctor for 15 years and had seen his share of tragedy, but the death of a mother with 7 young children was particularly harsh, even by frontier standards. "I'm sorry for your lost children," Doc said gently, his voice taking on the careful tone he used with grieving families. "Your mother ... she was sick long?" "Started as a cough," Tommy replied, standing straighter as he stepped forward to speak for his siblings. "Got worse real quick once the storm hit. Mr. Sullivan did everything he could to save her." Doc nodded, his eyes moving between Jacob and the children, clearly working through the implications. "And you've been caring for them since?" "They needed help," Jacob said simply. "Couldn't exactly turn 7 children out into a blizzard." "Of course not." Doc accepted the cup of coffee Jacob offered, using the moment to study the situation more carefully. The children were clean, well-fed, and while obviously grieving, they seemed comfortable in the house. But Doc's trained eye also noticed things that concerned him. 7 children was an enormous responsibility for any man, let alone a bachelor rancher living 20 miles from town. Little Rose, apparently unaware of the tension in the adult conversation, toddled over to Doc and tugged on his coat. "You fix people?" she asked with 3-year-old directness. Doc smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "I tried a little one. Are you feeling poorly?" "No, but Mama was sick. Mr. Jake tried to make her better, but she had to go sleep with the angels." The innocent words hung in the air, and Jacob saw Doc's expression shift as he processed the full scope of what had happened. A woman had died in Jacob's care, leaving 7 orphan children with no legal guardian and no clear path forward. "Jacob," Doc said quietly, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Tommy, keep an eye on the little ones. We'll be right outside." On the porch, with the door closed behind them, Doc got straight to the point. "What exactly are you planning to do with 7 children?" "Raise them," Jacob replied without hesitation. Doc stared at him. "Jacob, be realistic. 7 children? The youngest is barely out of diapers, and the oldest is 15. You're talking about a commitment that would last the next 15 years at minimum." "I'm aware of the mathematics, Doc." "Are you aware of the legalities?" Doc's voice sharpened. "You're not their father, not their legal guardian. The territorial government has procedures for situations like this." Jacob felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of procedures? Orphanages mostly. There's one in Helena, another in Butte City. They're equipped to handle large numbers of children, provide education, training for trades. Equipped to work. Children to death, you mean? Jacob said harshly. I've heard the stories, Doc. Those places are barely better than prisons. Doc sighed, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. Some are better than others. But the point is, there are proper channels for dealing with orphan children. You can't just adopt 7 children on your own say-so. Their mother asked me to keep them together. I gave her my word. The word of a dying woman, given in extremis, doesn't constitute legal guardianship. Jacob, there would need to be paperwork, investigations, hearings. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. Investigations into what? Your suitability as a guardian. Your financial stability, your character, your ability to provide for 7 children. The territorial authorities would want to know why a bachelor rancher thinks he can raise a family when he's never had children of his own. The words hit Jacob like physical blows, each one designed to highlight the impossibility of his situation. He thought of the promise he'd made to Catherine Richardson, of little Emma asking if he was really going to keep them, of Rose calling him Mr. Jake with complete trust. How long? Jacob asked quietly. How long what? How long before someone comes asking questions? Doc was quiet for a moment, studying Jacob's face. Officially? Pete Henderson's already spread word in town about the lights he saw during the storm. People are curious. Give it a week, maybe 2, before someone from the territorial office shows up to investigate. And unofficially? Doc glanced toward the house, where they could hear the muffled sounds of children's voices through the walls. Unofficially, I've got 7 patients in there who've just lost their mother and are depending on you for everything. Whatever the law says, those children need stability right now. Jacob felt a flicker of hope. You're not going to report this immediately? I'm going to examine the children, make sure they're healthy and being properly cared for. After that... Doc shrugged. I'm a doctor, not a territorial agent. My concern is medical welfare, not legal guardianship. They went back inside, where Doc conducted thorough examinations of each child. He checked for signs of malnutrition, illness, or abuse, the usual indicators that authorities looked for in cases of orphan children. What he found instead were 7 healthy, clean, well-fed children who clearly trusted their temporary guardian. Remarkable, Doc murmured to Jacob as he finished examining little Rose. Given what they've been through losing their father, the difficult journey, their mother's death, they're in surprisingly good condition. They're strong children, Jacob replied, watching as Tommy helped Billy button his shirt after the examination. They've been taking care of each other for months. Still, the little ones especially will need careful watching. Grief affects children differently than adults. Sometimes they seem fine for weeks, then suddenly start having nightmares or refusing to eat. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma appeared at Jacob's side, slipping her small hand into his much larger one. Mr. Jake, when is Doc going to leave? Why, sweetheart? Because I don't want him to take us away. The simple statement hit both men like a punch to the gut. Doc knelt down to Emma's level, his voice gentle. I'm not here to take anyone away, little one. I just wanted to make sure you and your brothers and sisters are healthy. We're healthy, Emma said solemnly. Mr. Jake takes good care of us. He makes sure we eat breakfast and say our prayers and brush our teeth. After Doc finished his examinations, Jacob walked him back to his horse. The afternoon sun was already beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. They're attached to you, Doc observed, tightening his horse's cinch. More than I would have expected after just a few days. Children need someone to depend on, Jacob replied. They've lost everyone else. Jacob, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Doc paused in his preparations, meeting Jacob's eyes directly. "Why are you doing this, really? 7 children is a lifetime commitment. Are you doing this out of guilt? Grief for your own losses? Some misguided sense of duty?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. Why was he doing this? The easy answer was the promise he'd made to Catherine Richardson. But that wasn't the whole truth, and both men knew it. "When Martha died," Jacob said finally, "I thought my chance at having a family died with her. Thought that part of my life was over, that I'd spend the rest of my days alone on this ranch until the ground claimed me too." He gestured toward the house, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows and the sound of children's laughter drifted on the evening air. Those 7 children walked through a blizzard to find help. They could have died a dozen times over, but they didn't give up. They fought for each other, protected each other, kept each other going when any sensible person would have laid down and died. That's not just survival, Doc. That's family. And you want to be part of that family. "I want to give them the chance to stay a family," Jacob corrected. "They've lost enough. I won't be the reason they lose each other too." Doc nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two men. The territorial authorities won't see it that way. They'll see an irregular situation that needs to be corrected according to proper procedures. Then we'll have to make sure the situation doesn't look irregular when they arrive. Doc raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jacob's mind was already working, formulating a plan that was desperate, but might just work. Those children need a legal guardian, someone the authorities will accept without question. Someone with an established household, good standing in the community, and experience raising children. "Jacob, you're a bachelor rancher with no children of your own. You don't meet any of those criteria." "No," Jacob agreed, "but I know someone who does." As Doc rode away into the gathering dusk, Jacob stood in his yard and looked at his house, truly looked at it for the first time in years. Through the windows he could see Tommy helping Mary set the table for supper while Sarah read a story to the younger children by the fire. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that his house hadn't witnessed since Martha's death, but it was also a scene that could be shattered in an instant if the territorial authorities decided that a bachelor rancher wasn't fit to raise 7 orphan children. Jacob had promised Catherine Richardson that her children would stay together, but keeping that promise was going to require more than good intentions. It was going to require a solution that would satisfy both the letter of the law and the needs of 7 children who had already lost too much. Walking back toward the house, listening to the sounds of family life spilling out into the Montana evening, Jacob began to formulate a plan that would either save the Richardson children or destroy any chance they had of staying together. Either way, he was running out of time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a postal rider who'd fought through muddy spring roads to deliver mail delayed by the great blizzard. Jacob recognized the careful handwriting immediately, neat, precise script that belonged to his sister-in-law, Rebecca Sullivan, writing from Denver. "Jacob," the letter began, "I pray this finds you well after the terrible storms we've been hearing about. I have news that I hope you'll consider carefully." Jacob sat at his kitchen table, 7 pairs of eyes watching him read, and felt the first stirring of what might be either salvation or catastrophe. Rebecca had been Martha's closest friend before becoming his brother's wife, and she was one of the few people in the world who understood the depth of grief that had consumed him after Martha's death. But more importantly, Rebecca was exactly what the territorial authorities would consider an ideal guardian for orphan children. "Is it bad news, Mr. Jake?" Rose asked, climbing onto his lap with the fearless trust that had become her trademark. "No, sweetheart," Jacob said, folding the letter carefully. "It might be very good news indeed." The letter contained information that would have been merely interesting a month ago, but now felt like divine intervention. Rebecca's husband, James Sullivan, Jacob's younger brother, had died suddenly of heart failure in January. Rebecca was alone in Denver with a large house, a comfortable inheritance, and no children of her own despite 15 years of marriage. More crucially, she was writing to ask if Jacob would consider coming to Denver to help her manage James's business interests. "I find myself quite alone," her letter continued, "and while I'm capable of handling most affairs, I would value the counsel of family during this difficult transition." Jacob reread the letter 3 times while the children waited patiently for an explanation. An idea was forming in his mind, audacious, complicated, and requiring a level of trust he wasn't sure he had the right to ask for. But it might be the only way to keep his promise to Catherine Richardson. "Tommy," Jacob said finally, "I need to ride to town to send a telegraph. Think you can manage things here for a few hours?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied immediately, straightening. "With the responsibility. Is everything all right?" "Everything might be about to get much better," Jacob said, lifting Rose down and reaching for his coat. "I'll explain when I get back." The ride to Billings gave Jacob time to think through his plan, to consider all the ways it could go wrong, and to convince himself it was the only viable option. By the time he reached the telegraph office, he'd rehearsed his message a dozen times. "Rebecca, stop, have proposal that might benefit both of you. Stop caring for 7 orphan children who need proper guardian. Stop. Would you consider marriage of convenience to provide them legal protection? Stop. Will explain fully by letter. Stop. Urgent reply needed." Stop. Jacob, the telegraph operator, a thin man named Hopkins who'd known Jacob for years, read the message twice before looking up with raised eyebrows. "You sure you want to send this exactly as written, Jake?" "Exactly as written," Jacob confirmed, though his stomach churned as he handed over the coins for transmission. The reply came faster than Jacob had dared hope, Rebecca's response arriving the very next afternoon. "Jacob, stop, your message intriguing. Stop, have heard about orphan trains and government institutions. Stop, send full details. Immediately. Stop, if children need protection, I am willing to discuss arrangements. Stop. Rebecca." Jacob spent that evening writing the longest letter of his life, explaining everything that had happened since the blizzard, describing each of the Richardson children in detail, and laying out his proposal as clearly as he could manage. "I'm not asking you to love me," he wrote. "We both know that what Martha's and I had, what you and James shared, doesn't come twice in a lifetime. But I am asking you to help me save 7 children who have already lost too much. In return, you would have the family you and James always wanted, and I would have the legal standing to protect them from the authorities who would separate them." He described his ranch, his financial situation, and the practical arrangements such a marriage would require. Most importantly, he gave Rebecca every detail about the children's personalities, their needs, and their potential. "Tommy is mature beyond his years, but needs to be allowed to be a boy sometimes. Mary is brilliant and should be encouraged in her education. Sarah has an imagination that could take her anywhere if nurtured properly. The twins require patience and firm guidance, but have good hearts. Emma is a natural caretaker who needs to learn it's acceptable to be cared for herself. And Rose is pure sunshine, but she needs consistency and love to heal from losing her parents." Jacob sealed the letter and sent it on the next mail run, then began the agonizing wait for Rebecca's decision. In the meantime, he had to prepare the children for the possibility that their lives were about to change again, this time he hoped, for the better. "Children," he said one evening as they gathered around the fire after supper, "I need to talk to you about something important." 7 faces turned toward him with the instant attention that came from children who had learned that adult conversations often determined their fate. "You know that Patterson was concerned about the legal situation, about whether I have the right to keep you all together." Tommy's jaw tightened. "Are they going to take us away?" "Not if I can help it," Jacob said firmly. "But we need to make some changes to ensure that doesn't happen. I've written to my sister-in-law in Denver. Her name is Rebecca, And she recently lost her husband, my brother James. Is she nice? Emma asked, the question that mattered most. To a 4-year-old. She's very nice, Jacob said truthfully. Martha, my late wife, used to say that Rebecca had the biggest heart of anyone she'd ever known. The thing is, I've asked Rebecca to consider coming here to help us. Help us how? Mary asked, her sharp mind already working through the implications. Jacob took a deep breath. This was the part he'd been dreading. I've asked her to marry me. Not for love, we're both still grieving our spouses, but to give you children a proper mother and father in the eyes of the law. Silence fell over the room like a blanket. The younger children looked confused, while the older ones clearly understood the gravity of what Jacob was proposing. You'd get married just to keep us together? Sarah asked, her 8-year-old mind struggling with the concept. Adults sometimes make practical arrangements when circumstances require it, Jacob said carefully. Rebecca needs family, and you children need legal protection. It would benefit everyone involved. But what if she doesn't like us? Ben asked, voicing the fear they were all feeling. What if we don't like her? Billy added. Jacob knelt down to their level. Those are fair questions, and honest ones. The truth is, I don't know what will happen. But I do know that Rebecca is a good woman who's been through her own grief and loss, and I know that she's the kind of person who would put your welfare above her own comfort. Would she really be our mother? Rose asked, climbing into Jacob's lap as she often did when discussions grew serious. She would be your guardian, Jacob said carefully. Someone who would love you and protect you and make sure you all stay together. Whether you choose to call her mother would be up to you. Tommy, who had been silent through the entire conversation, finally spoke. When would this happen? If Rebecca agrees to come, it would be soon. The territorial authorities could arrive. Any time to investigate our situation. We need to be prepared. And if she says no? Mary asked with devastating directness. Jacob's throat tightened. Then we'll figure out another way. I promised your mother you'd stay together, and I intend to keep that promise no matter what it takes. Rebecca's second letter arrived 4 days later, thick with multiple pages and accompanied by a smaller envelope marked, "For the children." Jacob's hands shook slightly as he read her response. Rebecca had clearly thought through every aspect of his proposal, examining it from practical, emotional, and legal perspectives. I have been alone since James's death, she wrote, and while I've managed his business affairs competently, I find myself longing for purpose beyond mere financial management. The idea of providing a home for 7 children who need protection appeals to both my practical nature and my desire to honor James's memory by creating the family we never had. She went on to detail her financial situation: comfortable, enough to support a large household, and her living arrangements. The house in Denver was large but would not accommodate 9 people. However, she was willing to relocate to Montana if Jacob's ranch could be expanded to house everyone properly. I propose a trial arrangement, Rebecca continued. I will come to Montana for 3 months to meet the children and assess the situation. If we all find the arrangement workable, we can proceed with a formal marriage and legal guardianship. If not, I will help you find alternative solutions that keep the children together. The letter for the children was shorter but warmer, introducing herself and expressing her eagerness to meet them. She included small gifts, hair ribbons for the girls, carved wooden toys for the boys, and a promise to bring more substantial presents when she arrived. I want you to know, she wrote to them, that I'm not coming to replace your parents, whose memory you should always cherish. I'm coming to be your friend and protector, to help you grow into the remarkable adults I'm sure you'll become. Jacob gathered the children and read both letters aloud. The response was mixed excitement from the younger ones about the gifts and the prospect of a new mama, cautious optimism from the older children who understood the practical benefits, and underlying nervousness from all of them about another major change in their lives. When is she coming? Tommy asked. Jacob checked the date on Rebecca's letter. She says she can be here within 2 weeks if we send word immediately. Are you going to tell her yes? Mary asked. Jacob looked around at the 7 faces watching. These children who had survived so much, who deserved stability and love and the chance to grow up together as a family. The decision felt enormous and terrifying and absolutely right. Yes, he said. I'm going to tell her yes. As he prepared another telegram that would change all their lives, Jacob reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. A blizzard had brought 7 children to his door. A promise to a dying woman had made him their protector. And now a marriage of convenience to a woman he hadn't seen in 3 years might be the key to keeping them all together. In 2 weeks, Rebecca Sullivan would arrive at the Triple Crown Ranch, and together they would discover whether practical arrangements could transform into something resembling a real family. The morning Rebecca Sullivan was due to arrive, Jacob found himself more nervous than he'd been since his cavalry days before a major engagement. He'd cleaned the house twice, repaired every loose board on the porch, and made the children practice their introductions until Tommy finally declared they sounded like trained circus animals. She's going to think we're trying too hard, Mary observed, adjusting Emma's hair ribbon for the 4th time. Maybe we are trying too hard, Jacob admitted, watching Ben and Billy wrestle over who got to hold the bouquet of wildflowers they'd picked for Rebecca. But it's important that she sees you're good children. We are good children, Sarah said with 8-year-old logic. Mostly. The sound of wagon wheels on the muddy road sent all 7 children running to the windows. Jacob took a deep breath and stepped onto the porch, his heart hammering as a hired wagon from town approached the house. Through the spring sunshine and morning mist, he could see a woman's figure sitting straight back beside the driver, several trunks and bags loaded in the wagon bed. Rebecca Sullivan stepped down from the wagon with the same graceful efficiency Jacob remembered from their brief acquaintance during his courtship of Martha. She was 34 now, with light brown hair pinned neatly beneath a practical traveling hat and intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was well made but sensible, the kind worn by a woman who valued quality over fashion. Jacob, she said, extending her gloved hand as he approached. Her voice was warm but measured, neither overly familiar nor coldly formal. Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming, Jacob replied, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. It's good to see you again, Rebecca. I'm sorry it's under such circumstances. Life rarely unfolds as we expect, Rebecca said simply, then looked past him toward the house where 7 faces were pressed against the windows. Are those my potential new family members attempting to hide behind the curtains? Jacob chuckled, despite his nervousness. They've been watching the road since dawn. Would you like to meet them? I can't think of anything I'd like more. As they walked toward the house, Jacob felt compelled to offer one last warning. They're good children, Rebecca, but they've been through a lot. They might be a bit overwhelming at first. Jacob, Rebecca said, pausing at the bottom of the porch steps. I've been alone in a house meant for a large family for 3 months. I assure you, I'm prepared for overwhelming. The front door burst open before they reached it, and 7 children spilled onto the porch in a rush of nervous energy and curiosity. They arranged themselves in a somewhat orderly line according to height, from Tommy down to little Rose, each clutching small gifts or flowers they'd prepared. Children, Jacob said formally, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Rebecca Sullivan. Rebecca, these are the Richardson children. Tommy stepped forward first, his 15-year-old dignity intact despite the circumstances. Ma'am, I'm Thomas Richardson, but everyone calls me Tommy. Thank you for coming to help us. Rebecca's eyes warmed as she shook his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tommy, and please call me Rebecca. One by one, the children introduced themselves with varying degrees of shyness and formality. Mary presented her with a carefully pressed wildflower, Sarah recited a short poem she'd composed for the occasion, and the twins jointly offered her a carved wooden horse they'd helped Jacob make. Emma hung back until Rebecca knelt down to her level. "And you must be Emma," Rebecca said gently. "I hear you're the one who takes such good care of little Rose." Emma nodded solemnly, then whispered, "Are you going to be our new mama?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and full of meaning. Rebecca glanced up at Jacob, then back to Emma's serious face. "I'm going to be your friend," Rebecca said carefully, "and I'm going to make sure you and your brothers and sisters can stay together always. Whether I become something more than that... Well, we'll have to see how we all get along." Finally, little Rose toddled forward, her blonde curls bouncing with each step. She stopped directly in front of Rebecca and announced, "You're pretty. Do you like cookies?" Rebecca laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that seemed to break whatever remaining ice existed between her and the children. "I love cookies. Do you know how to make them? Mr. Jake taught us. We made some for you, but Billy ate most of them. I did not." Billy protested. "Ben ate more than me. Did not. Did too." "Boys," Jacob said firmly, and they subsided with sheepish grins. Rebecca stood, brushing off her skirts, and Jacob was struck by how naturally she'd handled that first interaction. No artifice, no talking down to the children, just honest responses to honest questions. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside," Rebecca suggested. "The wagon driver is waiting to be paid, and I imagine you children have many more questions for me." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca admired the house, exclaimed over the children's various treasures and accomplishments, and gradually began to understand the dynamics of the family Jacob had inherited. She watched Tommy's protective hovering over his siblings, Mary's quiet competence in helping with practical matters, Sarah's tendency to retreat into imagination. When things became overwhelming, she noticed how the twins fed off each other's energy, how Emma mothered Rose while still clearly needing mothering herself, and how little Rose had attached herself to Jacob with the unquestioning trust of a child who had found safety after great fear. "You've done remarkable work with them," Rebecca told Jacob quietly while the children were outside playing after lunch. "They're obviously grieving, but they're not broken. That speaks to both their natural resilience and your care." "They've taught me more than I've taught them," Jacob admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing when they first arrived." "None of us do when children come into our lives," Rebecca said. "We simply do our best and hope it's enough." That evening, after the children had been settled for the night, Jacob and Rebecca sat by the fire discussing practical arrangements. The conversation was businesslike, but not cold, two adults working through the logistics of an unusual situation. "The house will need expansion if this arrangement becomes permanent," Rebecca observed. "7 children require proper bedrooms, and I'll need space for an office to manage my business correspondence." "I've been thinking about that," Jacob said. "We could add a wing to the east side, 4 bedrooms upstairs, office and sitting room downstairs. I've got the skills and most of the materials." "And financially?" Jacob had prepared for this conversation, gathering records of his assets and income. "The ranch is profitable, but supporting 9 people will stretch the budget. Your income would help significantly." "My income will be our income if we proceed with this marriage," Rebecca corrected. "I'm not interested in maintaining separate finances if we're to be truly married, even if it's primarily a practical arrangement." The word marriage hung between them, heavy with implication. They were both widowed, both still grieving their first loves, both entering this arrangement for practical rather than romantic reasons. Yet the reality of what they were contemplating, binding their lives together, creating a legal family, felt momentous. "Rebecca," Jacob said carefully, "I want to be clear about my expectations. I'm not asking you to. That is, this marriage would be ... a partnership," Rebecca finished for him. "I understand, Jacob. I'm not ready for anything more than that. And I suspect you aren't either. But I do expect mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to the children's welfare, of course. And I expect this to be a real marriage in the eyes of the law and the community. If we're going to provide these children with stability, we can't have people questioning the legitimacy of our arrangement." Jacob nodded, though the thought of presenting a false front made him uncomfortable. "How do you think the children are?" Taking to the idea, Rebecca considered the question. "The older ones understand the practical necessity. Tommy sees it as protection for his siblings, which aligns with his protective instincts. Mary appreciates the security it would provide. The younger ones, they want a mother figure, but they're also loyal to their birth mother's memory. And Rose wants everyone she loves to be happy and safe. She adjusts to whatever makes that possible." They talked until nearly midnight, working through details of sleeping arrangements, discipline, education, and the countless other considerations involved in merging 2 adults and 7 children into a functioning household. By the time they retired to their separate rooms, they had the framework of an agreement that could benefit everyone involved. But as Jacob lay awake listening to the sounds of his house full of people, he wondered if practical arrangements could ever truly become what these children needed, not just legal protection, but a real family built on love rather than necessity. The next morning brought news that made their timeline even more urgent. A rider arrived with word that territorial agents were indeed planning an investigation into the Richardson children's situation, prompted by reports from town about their unusual circumstances. "They'll be here within the week," the messenger informed Jacob. "Want to interview the children, assess their living conditions, determine proper placement." Rebecca, who had been feeding Rose breakfast, set down the spoon and met Jacob's eyes. Across the kitchen, the decision they'd been contemplating over 3 months now had to be made immediately. "How quickly can we arrange a wedding?" she asked calmly. Jacob felt his heart skip. "Judge Peterson could perform the ceremony tomorrow. If we ride into Billings today for the license, then that's what we'll do." Rebecca turned to address all 7 children, who had been listening with growing alarm to the adult conversation. "Children, it seems we need to move forward with our plans more quickly than expected. Would you like Jacob and me to get married tomorrow so that no one can question your right to stay together?" 7 heads nodded with varying degrees of understanding and enthusiasm. Tommy's nod was firm and determined. Mary's was thoughtful and measured. Sarah's was accompanied by a romantic sigh. The twins were energetic bounces. Emma's was serious and trusting, and Rose's was cheerful and complete. "Then it's settled," Rebecca said, as if deciding to get married to save 7 children was the most natural thing in the world. "We'll need to pack for a trip to town, and I'll need to send some telegrams to Denver to arrange my affairs." As the household erupted into organized chaos, packing bags, choosing clothes, and explaining to the younger children why they were suddenly rushing to town, Jacob marveled at the strange turns his life had taken. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary widower living alone on a Montana ranch. Tomorrow he would be a married man with 7 children and a wife he barely knew. But looking at Rebecca calmly directing the preparations while Rose clung to her skirts and the older children sought her advice about what to pack, Jacob began to think that maybe, just maybe, practical arrangements could evolve into something much more meaningful than either of them had dared to hope. The wedding of Jacob Sullivan and Rebecca Sullivan took place on a Thursday morning in Judge Peterson's cramped office above the Billings General Store, with 7 children as witnesses and the smell of pickle brine drifting up from the mercantile below. It was not the wedding either of them had dreamed of in their youth, but it was exactly what their circumstances required. Rebecca wore a simple blue dress she'd brought from Denver, with a small bouquet of prairie flowers that Sarah had insisted on picking that morning. Jacob had borrowed a proper suit from the hotel keeper, though it pulled tight across his shoulders and was an inch too short in the sleeves. The children were scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes. which ranged from Tommy's outgrown Sunday shirt to Rose's tiny dress that Rebecca had quickly altered to fit properly. "Do you, Jacob Samuel Sullivan, take Rebecca Marie Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Peterson intoned, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority that would protect 7 young lives. "I do," Jacob said, meaning it more completely than he'd expected. Looking at Rebecca, he saw not just a solution to their problems, but a woman of genuine courage who was willing to sacrifice her independence to save children she'd known for barely 3 days. "Do you, Rebecca Marie Sullivan, take Jacob Samuel Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Rebecca's gray eyes met Jacob's steadily. "I do." The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief and formal, witnessed by 7 children who understood that this simple ceremony had just secured their future. But as their lips touched, both Jacob and Rebecca felt something shift. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of a partnership that might grow into something neither of them had dared hope for. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Peterson announced. With a smile, "I present Mr. and Mrs. Jacob Sullivan and their 7 children." The ride back to the ranch was subdued, each person lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. The children seemed to understand instinctively that something momentous had occurred, though the younger ones weren't entirely sure what it meant. "Are you really married now?" Emma asked Rebecca as the wagon bounced along the muddy road. "We really are," Rebecca confirmed, adjusting Emma's position on her lap. "Does that mean you're our mama now?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "It means I'm your guardian, and Jacob is your guardian, and will take care of you always. Whether you want to call me Mama is up to you." Rose, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly piped up. "Can I call you Mama Becca?" The name seemed to strike everyone as exactly right. Within minutes, all the children were trying it out, and Rebecca found herself blinking back tears at the sound of it. "Mama Becca," she repeated softly. "I like that very much." They arrived home to find an official-looking black carriage waiting in their yard, and Jacob's blood turned to ice. 3 men in dark suits stood on his porch, one of them holding an official-looking folder of papers. "Mr. Sullivan?" The eldest of the 3 stepped forward as Jacob helped Rebecca down from the wagon. "I'm Agent Morrison from the Territorial Office of Child Welfare. We're here to investigate reports of 7 orphan children in your care." Jacob felt Rebecca's hand slip into his, a gesture that appeared affectionate, but felt like steel reinforcement. "Gentlemen," Jacob said calmly, "I'm Jacob Sullivan, and this is my wife Rebecca. How can we help you?" Agent Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your wife? We were told you were a bachelor rancher." "I was," Jacob replied. "We were married this morning in Billings." Judge Peterson performed the ceremony. The 3 agents exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this development. The second agent, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward. "I'm Agent Hartwell. We still need to conduct our investigation. Mr. Sullivan, a hastily arranged marriage doesn't automatically qualify you as suitable guardians for 7 children." "Of course," Rebecca said before Jacob could respond, her voice warm but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing business affairs. "We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Children, why don't you go inside and wash up from our trip? The gentleman will want to speak with you shortly." As the children filed into the house, Jacob noticed how naturally they responded to Rebecca's direction, how Tommy helped the younger ones while Mary organized their belongings. To outside eyes, they already looked like a functioning family. "Impressive," Agent Morrison noted, obviously seeing the same thing. "How long have you been caring for these children, Mr. Sullivan?" 6 weeks, Jacob replied honestly. "Their mother died during the February blizzard. She asked me to keep them together. And you, Mrs. Sullivan," Agent Hartwell addressed Rebecca, "how long have you known these children?" 3 days, Rebecca said without hesitation. "But sometimes you know immediately when something is right." The third agent, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I'm Agent Cooper. Mrs. Sullivan, you understand the magnitude of what you've undertaken? 7 children, ages 3 to 15, with no blood relation to either of you." "Agent Cooper," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the crisp tone she'd once used to manage her late husband's business dealings. "My husband and I have discussed this thoroughly. We have adequate financial resources, a stable home, and the commitment necessary to raise these children properly. More importantly, they need us." "Need you?" Agent Morrison's tone was skeptical. "They need proper institutional care, education, training for productive trades. They need to stay together," Jacob interrupted firmly. "They're a family. Breaking them up would be cruel and unnecessary." For the next 2 hours, the agents conducted a thorough investigation. They interviewed each child separately, examined the house from attic to cellar, reviewed Jacob's financial records, and questioned both adults extensively about their plans for education, discipline, and the children's futures. Jacob found himself impressed by Rebecca's handling of the interrogation. She answered every question with calm confidence, demonstrating a thorough understanding of child development, education requirements, and family management that surprised even him. "Tommy wants to study engineering," she told Agent Hartwell when asked about the children's educational plans. "We'll arrange for advanced mathematics and science tutoring. Mary shows exceptional academic promise and should be encouraged toward teaching or perhaps medicine. Sarah's imagination suggests artistic pursuits, while the twins need structured physical activity and practical skills training." "And the younger girls?" Agent Cooper asked. "Emma needs encouragement to be a child, rather than a caretaker, though her nurturing instincts should be valued. Rose requires stability, affection, and the security of knowing her family will never be separated again." Jacob watched the agent's expression soften as Rebecca spoke. This wasn't the hastily arranged guardianship they'd expected to find, but a thoughtful, well-planned family structure. The individual interviews with the children went better than Jacob had dared hope. Tommy spoke maturely about his family's needs and his trust in Jacob and Rebecca. Mary demonstrated her intelligence and expressed genuine enthusiasm about her educational opportunities. Even the younger children, when asked if they felt safe and happy, responded with unanimous positivity. "Mr. Jake saved us from the storm," Rose told Agent Morrison with 3-year-old sincerity. "And Mama Becca makes really good cookies. We're a family now." As the afternoon wore on, Jacob began to sense the agent's initial skepticism giving way to cautious approval. The house was clean and well organized, the children were healthy and obviously cared for, and both adults demonstrated genuine commitment to their welfare. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan," Agent Morrison said finally, gathering his papers. "I'll be honest, when we received reports of a bachelor rancher caring for 7 orphan children, we expected to find an irregular situation requiring immediate intervention." Jacob held his breath, feeling Rebecca's tension beside him. "However," Morrison continued, "what we've found is a family. Unconventional in its formation, perhaps, but clearly functional and beneficial to all involved." "Does that mean?" Rebecca began. "It means we'll be filing a report recommending official recognition of your guardianship," Agent Hartwell said. "The marriage, while recent, appears to be a legitimate arrangement for the children's benefit. Your financial situation is stable, your home is adequate, and the children themselves express genuine attachment to both of you." Relief flooded through Jacob so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. Beside him, Rebecca let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for hours. "There will be follow-up visits," Agent Cooper warned. "Quarterly for the first year, then annually. We'll want to monitor the children's progress, particularly their education and social development." "Of course," Jacob said. "We want what's best for them." "There is one more thing," Agent Morrison said, his expression growing serious. "We understand the children's mother wished to be buried beside their father in Boot City. We can arrange for transport and burial, if you'd like. Jacob felt his throat tighten. Catherine Richardson deserved to rest beside her husband, but the practical challenges had seemed insurmountable. That would... We'd be very grateful. Consider it done. The territorial government can handle the arrangements as part of our services. For orphaned children. After the agents left, promising to return with the burial arrangements within a few days, the Sullivan family, for that's what they were now, legally and practically gathered in the kitchen for a celebratory supper. So, we can really stay together? Sarah asked, still needing confirmation. Forever and always, Rebecca assured her, serving generous portions of the stew she'd somehow managed to prepare during the agent's visit. Are you really married to Mr. Jake now? Emma asked, the question that had been bothering her all day. Rebecca and Jacob exchanged glances across the table. Their marriage was real in every legal sense, but the emotional reality was still developing. We really are, Rebecca said. We're a family now, all of us. That night, after the children were settled in their beds, Jacob and Rebecca sat by the fire discussing the day's events. The formal investigation was over, their guardianship was secure, and 7 children were sleeping peacefully under their protection. Thank you, Jacob said quietly, for everything. For coming here, for marrying me, for handling those agents like you've been managing children your whole life. Thank you for letting me be part of this, Rebecca replied. I've been alone since James died, wondering what purpose my life might serve. Now I know. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had entered a marriage of convenience and discovered it might become something much more meaningful. Outside, spring wind whispered through the pines, and inside, their house full of children breathed with the rhythm of family life. The great test was over. They had faced official scrutiny and emerged as a legitimate family. But Jacob sensed that the real test, building genuine love and connection among 9 very different people, was just beginning. 3 months after the wedding, Jacob woke to the sound of Rebecca's laughter drifting through the walls of their expanded ranch house. He lay still for a moment, marveling at how that sound had become as familiar and comforting as the morning call of meadowlarks in the pasture. Through his bedroom window, he could see the framework of the new addition taking shape. 4 bedrooms. Upstairs, Rebecca's office and a proper sitting room. Below, the sleeping arrangements had been one of their first practical challenges. Jacob had insisted Rebecca take the main bedroom while he moved to the small spare room, but she'd suggested instead that they each take one of the new rooms being built. We should both have fresh starts, she'd said, and Jacob had understood that she meant more than just sleeping quarters. Uncle Jake. Lily's voice rang out from the kitchen, followed by Ben's echo of Uncle Jake. The twins had taken to calling him Uncle, while Tommy and Mary used Mr. Sullivan, and the girls had settled on various versions of Papa Jake. Rebecca was universally Mama Becca now, a title she wore with growing comfort and pride. Jacob dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found organized chaos in full swing. Rebecca stood at the stove, her hair pinned up but already escaping in the humidity from cooking, directing breakfast preparations while Rose sat on a high stool beside her, carefully stirring something in a bowl. "Morning, Papa Jake," Rose chirped, her blonde curls bouncing as she stirred. "I'm helping make flapjacks. I can see that, sweetheart. You're getting to be quite the cook." Tommy was at the table helping Emma with her letters, while Mary supervised the twins' attempt to set the table without breaking anything. Sarah sat by the window, reading aloud from a book of poetry Rebecca had brought from Denver. The scene was domestic harmony that still sometimes caught Jacob off guard with its completeness. "Sleep well?" Rebecca asked, glancing up from the griddle, with a smile that had become less careful and more genuine over the past months. Like a rock. "What's the occasion for the feast?" "It's Saturday," Mary announced, as if that explained everything. "Mama Becca says Saturdays are for special breakfasts and family projects. Emma added, carefully forming her letters under Tommy's patient guidance. Jacob poured himself coffee from the pot Rebecca always had ready and settled into what had become his chair at the expanded table. The morning routine had evolved naturally, Rebecca managing the kitchen with help from the girls, Tommy mentoring the younger children, the twins creating just enough chaos to keep things interesting. "What's today's family project?" Jacob asked. "We're going to plant the kitchen garden," Rebecca said, sliding a plate of perfectly golden flapjacks in front of him. "The ground's finally warm enough, and the children need to learn about growing their own food." It was these moments Rebecca saying "we" and "the children" with natural ownership that convinced Jacob their arrangement was transforming into something neither of them had expected. She'd thrown herself into motherhood with the same competence she'd once applied to business affairs, but with a warmth that suggested genuine affection rather than mere duty. After breakfast, the family trooped outside to the patch of ground Rebecca had selected for the garden. She'd ordered seeds from Denver beans, carrots, onions, squash, and herbs, along with proper gardening tools sized for small hands. "The first rule of gardening," Rebecca announced to her assembled students, "is that everything has its season. Plant too early, and frost will kill your seeds. Too late, and the growing season is too short for a proper harvest." Jacob watched from the porch as she organized the children into teams, assigning each group a section of the garden. Tommy and Mary worked together on the larger vegetables. The twins were given the bean rows, hard to mess up, Rebecca had whispered to Jacob, while Sarah, Emma, and Rose were in charge of the herb garden. "Just like families," Sarah observed with 8-year-old wisdom, "everything has to happen at the right time." Rebecca paused in her seed distribution, struck by the girl's insight. "That's very wise, Sarah. Sometimes we have to wait for the right season for good things to grow." The morning's work was punctuated by laughter. Minor disasters, Billy accidentally dumped half the carrot seeds in one hole, and the kind of teaching moments that Jacob was learning to recognize as Rebecca's specialty. She never simply corrected mistakes. She used them as opportunities to explain why something worked or didn't work. "Uncle Jake," then called out, holding up a earthworm he'd unearthed, "is this a good worm or a bad worm?" "Good worm," Jacob replied, kneeling beside the boy. "Worms help make the soil rich so plants can grow better. Like how Mama Becca helps make our family rich so we can grow better?" Rose asked with the startling perception that sometimes emerged from her 3-year-old observations. Jacob met Rebecca's eyes across the garden plot, seeing his own surprise reflected there. "Yes, sweetheart, exactly like that." That afternoon, while the children napped or played quietly, Jacob and Rebecca worked on the house addition. She'd insisted on learning carpentry, claiming that a woman managing a household should understand how things were built. Jacob had been skeptical at first, but Rebecca approached construction with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything else. "Hand me that level," she said, checking the frame for the upstairs window. "I want to make sure this is square before we move to the next section." Jacob passed her the tool, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Such casual contact had become more common over the months, not romantic exactly, but comfortable in a way that suggested growing intimacy. "Rebecca," Jacob said, taking advantage of their rare moment alone, "I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for what you've done for the children, but for this." He gestured toward the house, the garden, the sounds of children playing safely nearby. Rebecca paused in her measurements, her gray eyes studying his face. "Jacob, I need to tell you something. When I came here, I thought I was doing a good deed helping 7 children and gaining a family in the process. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about obligation. What did it become about?" "Love," she said simply. "I love those children as if I'd borne them myself. And She hesitated, then forged ahead with characteristic honesty. I've grown to care for you more than I expected when we made our practical arrangement." Jacob felt his heart skip in a way it hadn't since Martha's death. Rebecca ... "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I know we both married for practical reasons, and I know we both still carry grief for our first loves. But I wanted you to know that this has become real for me. This family, this life we're building, it's not pretense anymore." Before Jacob could respond, Rose's voice called out from the house, "Mama Becca, Papa Jake, come see what we made." They found the children in the kitchen, where they'd apparently spent their quiet time creating an elaborate tea party for Rebecca's collection of dolls. The table was set with mismatched cups and saucers, and each doll was positioned with careful attention to proper etiquette. "It's a welcome party," Emma explained proudly, "for the dolls, so they know they're part of our family now too." Jacob watched Rebecca's face soften as she surveyed the scene. Every doll from her childhood collection, carefully packed and brought from Denver, had been included in the children's imaginary celebration. "This is beautiful," Rebecca said, her voice slightly husky. "Should we join the party?" For the next hour, 9 people crowded around a kitchen table, having an elaborate tea party with a collection of porcelain dolls. Jacob found himself holding a tiny teacup and discussing the weather with a doll named Cordelia, while Rose served imaginary cakes and the twins debated whether dolls could actually eat. It was ridiculous and perfect, and exactly the kind of moment Jacob had never imagined having in his carefully ordered bachelor life. That evening, after the children were settled and the house had grown quiet, Jacob found Rebecca in her new office, working on correspondence by lamplight. She'd maintained her business interests in Denver through letters and occasional trips to town for telegrams, managing her affairs with the same efficiency she brought to family life. "May I come in?" She looked up from her papers, smiling. Of course. I was just finishing a letter to my solicitor about some property investments." Jacob settled into the chair across from her desk, gathering courage for a conversation that had been building all day. "About what you said earlier, during the construction work." Rebecca set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "I want you to know that this has become real for me too," Jacob said. "When I married you, I thought I was simply fulfilling an obligation to Catherine Richardson. But watching you with the children, seeing how you've made this house into a home, working beside you every day, Rebecca, I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them like morning mist, delicate and transformative. Rebecca's eyes brightened with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Jacob, we don't have to rush anything," she said softly. "We have time to let whatever this is develop naturally. I know. But I wanted you to know where my heart is heading." Rebecca stood and moved around the desk, stopping close enough that Jacob could smell the lavender soap she favored. "And I wanted you to know that my heart is heading in the same direction." She leaned down and kissed him gently, not the perfunctory kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something warmer and more promising. When they separated, both were slightly breathless. "The children," Rebecca said, glancing toward the door. Sound asleep," Jacob finished, understanding her concern. They were navigating uncharted territory, transforming a marriage of convenience into something deeper, while maintaining the stability 7 children needed. "We should probably take this slowly," Rebecca said, though she made no move to step away from him. "Probably," Jacob agreed, though his hand had somehow found its way to her waist. A loud thump from upstairs, followed by muffled giggling, broke the spell. They looked at each other and laughed. "The twins," they said simultaneously. "I should check on them," Rebecca said, but her eyes lingered on Jacob's face. "We should both check on them," Jacob corrected, understanding that they were now partners in all aspects of family life. As they climbed the stairs together to investigate whatever mischief Ben and Billy had created, Jacob reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this moment. A blizzard, 7 desperate children, a promise to a dying woman, and a marriage of convenience that was becoming something much more meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, children to raise, a ranch to run, the ongoing work of building a family from the diverse pieces of their lives. But tonight, Jacob Sullivan was content to be exactly where he was, climbing the stairs of his expanded house beside the woman who had become his true partner, preparing to tuck in 7 children who called them both by names that meant love, safety, and home. 1 year later, Jacob stood in the doorway of the completed house addition, watching his family prepare for their first Thanksgiving as the Sullivan clan. The kitchen bustled with organized activity as Rebecca directed the preparation of their feast, her flour-dusted apron and escaped wisps of hair making her look more beautiful to Jacob than she had on their wedding day. "Papa Jake, can you reach the good china?" Mary called out, standing on her tiptoes at the high cabinet. At 11, she'd grown 3 inches and gained the confidence that came from being truly secure in her place in the world. "Coming, sweetheart," Jacob replied, marveling at how natural the word sweetheart had become when addressing any of his 7 children. Because that's what they were now, his children, legally adopted 6 months ago when the territorial courts finalized their guardianship papers. The adoption ceremony had been a simple affair, but watching 7 children officially become Sullivans had moved both Jacob and Rebecca to tears. Tommy Sullivan, Mary Sullivan, Sarah Sullivan, Ben Sullivan, Billy Sullivan, Emma Sullivan, and Rose Sullivan, each name spoken aloud, had felt like a promise fulfilled. Uncle Jake. Ben called from the dining room, where he and Billy were attempting to set the formal table without disaster. "We can't remember which side the forks go on." "Left side," Rebecca called out before Jacob could answer, her voice carrying the easy authority of a woman who'd been managing household chaos for over a year. "And be careful with great-grandmother's crystal glasses." Jacob smiled, remembering Rebecca's decision to bring her finest family heirlooms from Denver. "These children deserve to eat from good china and learn proper manners," she declared. "They're not charity cases, they're our family." Sarah emerged from the sitting room, where she'd been arranging autumn flowers in Rebecca's crystal vases. At 9, she'd blossomed under Rebecca's encouragement of her artistic talents, and her arrangements rivaled anything seen in the finest Denver homes. "Mama Becca, should I light the candles now or wait until everyone sits down?" Sarah asked. "Wait until we're ready to sit," Rebecca replied, then turned to Jacob with the smile that still made his heart skip. "Speaking of sitting, have you seen Emma and Rose? They disappeared 20 minutes ago," Jacob chuckled. "Check the root cellar. Rose discovered she can hide there, and Emma always follows to make sure she doesn't get into the preserves." "Sure." "Enough," giggles from below stairs confirmed his suspicion. Emma appeared moments later, herding 4-year-old Rose ahead of her like a shepherd with a wayward lamb. "Rose wanted to see if the pickles were ready," Emma announced with 5-year-old seriousness. "I told her Mama Becca said they need to sit longer." "Very responsible, Emma," Rebecca said, lifting Rose up for a quick hug. "And you, little miss, need to wash those pickle-sticky hands before dinner." As Rebecca carried Rose to the wash basin, Jacob watched the easy affection between them and felt his chest tighten with gratitude. Rebecca had kept every promise she'd made that first day. She'd loved these children as her own, protected them, nurtured their individual talents, and created the stable home they desperately needed. But more than that, she'd become the center of their family in ways Jacob couldn't have imagined. She was the one they ran to with scraped knees and hurt feelings, the one who knew exactly how to comfort nightmares and celebrate achievements. She'd become their mother not through blood, but through choice and daily devotion. "Tommy, would you ring the dinner bell?" Rebecca called to the kitchen, where their oldest was carving the turkey with skills Jacob had taught him over the summer. The bell's clear tone rang across the valley, a sound that had come to symbolize home for all of them. As they gathered around the expanded dining table, now large enough to seat 9 comfortably, Jacob looked at each face, illuminated by candlelight, and marveled at the journey that had brought them together. Tommy, now 16 and growing into his father's height, had found his balance between responsibility and boyhood. He still looked after his siblings, but he'd also discovered a passion for engineering that Rebecca was nurturing through correspondence courses. Mary had become Rebecca's right hand in household management, while excelling in advanced studies that would prepare her for the teaching career she'd dreamed of. Her quick mind and gentle nature made her a natural educator. Sarah continued to see magic in the world around her, filling notebooks with stories and poems that Rebecca carefully preserved. Her imagination had become a gift rather than an escape. Ben and Billy, now 7, had channeled their boundless energy into helping Jacob with ranch work. They could mend fences, tend livestock, and ride horses with the fearless confidence of boys raised on the land. Emma, at 5, had grown into her role as Rose's devoted big sister, while learning to accept care and attention for herself. She'd started school in town, riding with Tommy and Mary 3 days a week, and Rose's little sunshine had grown from a traumatized 3-year-old into a confident, joyful child who called Jacob Papa and Rebecca Mama with complete certainty about her place in their family. "Before we eat," Jacob said, rising to his feet, "I want to say something." 7 young faces turned toward him expectantly, while Rebecca's eyes sparkled with curiosity and affection. "2 years ago, I was a man alone, convinced that my chance for family had died with Martha. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in this house, taking care of the land and nothing more." Jacob's voice grew thick with emotion. "Then a blizzard brought 7 incredible souls to my door, and everything changed." "You saved us, Papa Jake," Emma said softly. "No, sweetheart," Jacob replied, looking around the table. "You saved me. All of you. You taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice, and love, and the decision to take care of each other no matter what." He turned to Rebecca, whose eyes were bright with tears. "And you, my dear wife, you gave us all the gift of legitimacy and love. You chose to love children who weren't yours, to build a life with a man you barely knew, to risk your heart for the sake of keeping a family together." "We all chose each other," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Every day we keep choosing each other." "To the Sullivan family," Jacob said, raising his glass of cider. "May we never forget how precious it is to be chosen and to choose in return." "To the Sullivan family." 7 young voices chorused, followed by the clink of glasses and the kind of laughter that fills a house and makes it home. As they began their feast, Jacob caught Rebecca's eye across the table. In her face, he saw not just the woman who'd agreed to a marriage of convenience, but his true partner, the love he'd never expected to find again, and the mother his children had needed. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, gentle flakes that would blanket the valley in white. But inside the Sullivan house, warmth reigned, the warmth of family love, of promises kept, and of hearts that had found their way home through the storm. The blizzard that had once threatened to destroy everything had instead become the beginning of their greatest blessing. 7 children who'd walked through snow in desperation to find help had discovered something even more valuable, a family that would never let them go. And Jacob Sullivan, who'd thought his story was ending, had learned that sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin with the words, "Please, mister, our mama is dying in the snowstorm. Please help her." He had helped. They all had helped each other. And in doing so, they'd created something eternal, a family bound not by blood, but by love, the strongest bond of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
in any case, Lark, did I tell you I got laid off? I think you were around for it. I think so. I think you might have been. Or at least I know Red was around when I told Nine. Yeah, it happened last Wednesday. I was still processing it when I had like my big stream on Saturday, and just since then, just says what it fucking is. I got 60 days notice though. I guess that's something. So for the next 30 days, I'm business as usual, like working in typical fashion. And then the last 30 days is when I send in my peripherals and they're doing like, I assume that's when they're doing company restructuring. And I don't have to do anything for those 30 days. And then have a severance for 9 weeks. So in essence, it's nearly 13 weeks. I think it's going to be more like 14 weeks in total, since I have decided not to take my vacation to Toronto. Well, I'm for certain I won't be able to, but I'll still be able to take a vacation during the time I'm officially still like during this 30-day period of working. Still, since I had already requested the time off, I'm gonna just reduce the days I'm off and just take the floating holidays to use now while I can, you know. Take advantage of the time I still have left, you know. Might as well take advantage of that, you know. Wait, I'm already on. Wait, is it the 34th? Or did I get to the 30? Did I already do 34 rows? Let me count this.